speaker, and it's gonna give a big picture, synthesis perspective, and it's gonna be followed by the talk from early career scientist speaker about new data and methods. And each talk is going to be about 20 minutes. And at the end, you're going to have a chance to ask questions about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to ask questions for both speakers. Please raise hand and write questions in the chat. I can either read the question in the chat or ask you to ask the question yourself at the end. Uh, Another information about the seminar is each seminar gonna be held on the last Tuesday of each month, and the time is either 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. in the evening on the central time, depending on the speaker's location. So just a reminder of the upcoming seminars. We're gonna have two seminars on May 26th at 3 p.m. Central Time about trace metal inputs from in polar environments from John Hawkins from University of Pennsylvania, followed by the presentation from Laramie Jensen from Columbia University, and on June 30th, and we're gonna have another seminar on atmospheric aerosol disposition to the global ocean at 3 p.m. Central Time by Clifton Buck, University of Georgia, and Prema Piusapanda from Stellenbosch University. So the seminar for today is going to be about data synthesis, modeling, and integration. And we welcoming two presentation from Dr. Gregory de Souza. He's a lecturer from ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and he's gonna talk about using model to build process understanding, give us a big picture perspective. And the second presentation is from Dr. Arianna Olivelli from Flanders Marine Institute, and she's gonna give a presentation about using machine learning to study lead in the ocean. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Gregory de Souza for his first presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Ayn, and to the entire GeoTrace's Early Career Researchers Committee for asking Arianna and me to present today. I'm going to try and share my screen with you. And then we can start. Okay, so I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an overview. As you'll see, it's very much an overview that is biased by my own particular interests and methods, but still an overview of how we can use models to build process understanding when it comes to trace metal cycling and the interactions between the ocean and its margins. And I thought I'd start in terms of bringing it all together with looking at sort of the DNA of GeoTraces and sort of thinking about how this program started over 20 years ago by looking at its planning workshops. And if you do that, going back into sort of the mid-2000s, there were a whole range of various different planning workshops that took place all over the world, starting with data management, thinking about intercalibration, planning where the cruises need to go. And one of the things that struck me as I was looking back over this is that the first data model synergy workshop that GeoTraces planned took place in 2007, and I think this was actually even before the first ship sailed for the International Polar Year. For GeoTraces, of course, I mean. There was another one a few years later. And one of the things, I think that early moment of data model synergy was key. And it has been very much an idea that's sort of baked into the planning of geotraces. The reason for this is quite simple. It's the fact that, if we think about our favorite GeoTraces diagram of how trace element and isotope distributions are controlled by processes that happen either at the interfaces or within the ocean. In order to understand any one of those processes, whether that be atmospheric deposition, interaction with sediments on the shelves or in the deep sea, or internal cycling within the ocean, we need to understand how those processes interact with the ocean's circulation. And this is something, of course, that everyone planning geotraces was very much aware of, and is one of the reasons why data model synergy and data synthesis has been such a focus of this program. I thought I'd like to give you an example of how circulation and cycling interact by taking a composite profile from up the Atlantic from the Intermediate Data Product 2025 of two different elements. And so we're looking here at depth sections from south to north of cadmium on the one hand, concentrations, and at the bottom, aluminium. And I chose these two elements because they seem the perfect sort of contrasting examples of how the very same circulation, the formation of North Atlantic deep water and its transport southward, can produce fundamentally exactly opposite distributions in the one element of cadmium, where we have low concentrations coming south and high concentrations going north, versus aluminium, where there are high concentrations coming south in North Atlantic deep water. And all of this, of course, has to do with how this one circulation interacts with the different distributions of sources and sinks of these elements at its interfaces and within the ocean. One way of thinking about that convolution of circulation and cycling is something that is known as the transport matrix method. And this is something that has been developed within the field of oceanography over the last 20 years or so. And it's a way of thinking about tracer distributions in the ocean and their change with time as the sum of two processes, one of which you can think about as the circulation, right? So this transport matrix A is the ocean circulation acting on the concentration of a tracer. And then something else that is called Q here, which is all of the biogeochemistry of that element, all of its geochemical behavior, its biological behavior, external sources and sinks of that. Yeah? One of the nice things about this is that if we care about the steady state distribution of this tracer C, the solution to that problem is actually very straightforward. Its time derivative goes to 0. And we can solve this system of coupled equations through any programming language of our choice in order to directly compute a steady state solution for the distribution of something like, let's say, epsilon neodymium in the global ocean. I'm showing you here an example from a recent paper by Wise et al. Yeah? So this transport matrix method allows us to very quickly and very efficiently produce, to think about that convolution of circulation and cycling. I should point out, for those of you who are interested in these methods, that there are, to my knowledge, at least 3 community-developed open source packages for doing transport matrix method modeling, where you can essentially choose your programming language of choice, whether you prefer Julia, MATLAB, Python, or C, in order to run your own global circulation models. Because they're relatively computationally efficient, these kinds of frameworks are perfect test beds for testing hypotheses and for building intuition, for producing the kind of sort of synthetic understanding of how tracer distributions represent process. And I want to show you a few examples of what I mean by that. So we can ask to test a hypothesis, what process or combination of processes explains the distribution that we observe. And an early example of this was Seth John's interest in the iron concentration distribution along GP16 here in the equatorial Pacific. And very specifically, that this paper was interested in the fact that if we look off the Peru margin, the color maps, which are the same over all three panels, show elevated concentrations of iron, not just at the shelf, but also coming deep off the slope. And these three diagrams here show you three different hypotheses for why the iron should be coming off at maybe 1,000 or 1,500 meters as opposed to in the very shallow ocean. What Seth did was to use the transport matrix method to test out different hypotheses. So this is now a model solution showing you what you would get if, for instance, iron were released into the ocean at all depths, which is the panel A, at only at certain depths, or for instance, if it was released shallowly, but somehow through particle seawater interaction, brought deeper down onto the slope. So this is a sort of a perfect example of how you might test mechanistically different hypotheses against an observed distribution. You can also take it a step further and use all of the wonderful diagnostics that models allow you to dig a bit deeper into that. Mark Holzer and Mark Brzezinski in 2015 looked at a global model of silicon concentrations. And I'm showing you here concentrations of silicon from south to north in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, and in the Indian. And in this transport matrix model of silicon, Mark and Mark were able to deconvolve silicon into its two components that we think about for biogeochemical traces, into its preformed component and to its regenerated component. So the stuff that comes from the surface ocean through transport and the stuff that's added through opal dissolution. And so you can think about how those two components interact with each other, and you can get even fancier and essentially color your silicon by where it left the ocean, right? Whether it was in the Central Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, or in the Southern Ocean, and look at how the preformed distribution, or the distribution of preformed silicon from the Southern Ocean, for instance, differs from the distribution of regenerated silicon that last came from the Southern Ocean, or the Central Atlantic, or the North Atlantic. And being able to pull apart tracer distributions like this really allows for the building of an intuition of how sources and sinks in the ocean interact with the global circulation. One can become a little bit more quantitative than that and think about diagnosing process. In some ways, sometimes these are called diagnostic models, sometimes they're called inverse models. Essentially, what they're doing is asking the question, not just what process, but what is the magnitude and what are the distributions of fluxes that I need in order to produce the distribution of a tracer that I observe. There's one example here from Saeed Roshan and Tim DeVries, looking at the distribution of cadmium in the ocean, and specifically how why cadmium, while being very closely correlated with phosphate concentrations in the ocean, displays this nonlinear interaction between the two. So if we think about this transport matrix representation of the cadmium cycle, the question that Saeed and Tim were asking here is, what is J, right? if I know what my cadmium distribution is, what does the distribution of sources and sinks have to be? They did this interestingly by producing a map of global surface cadmium concentrations, and they did this using a neural network trained on GEOTRACES data, and then essentially inverted this for what the fluxes of cadmium and phosphorus need to be out of the surface ocean. So what's the stoichiometry of phytoplankton uptake from the surface ocean that it can explain this distribution? And the answer that they got from this diagnostic model inversion suggested something that has been proposed before and shows rather nicely that the high latitudes, and specifically the Southern Ocean, is very key in producing that slight decoupling between cadmium and phosphate in the ocean through elevated stoichiometry of uptake. If we begin to think about external sources of elements to the ocean, one of the classical examples of that is aluminium, which comes into the ocean from dust. And there was once again, using the transport matrix method, Hairong Zhu and Tom Weber used GeoTraces data to answer this question, to answer the question of how much dust must be being supplied to the ocean through deposition. What they chose to do was to produce an aluminium, a model of aluminium cycling in the ocean. And then with these data constraints that you can see in the black lines here, combined with 12 different models of dust deposition into the ocean and 5 different versions of a circulation model, they looked at how they could best explain the GeoTraces dissolved aluminium distributions with their model, given dust distributions to the ocean. And this gives you an example of why the transport matrix method can be so powerful, because they were able to construct and conduct 60 different 3D global ocean model simulations, allowing them to not only optimize their results, which are the y-axis, to the observations, but also produce maps of soluble aluminium deposition in the ocean, and perhaps most importantly, not just one map, but a map with uncertainty, right? And this is uncertainty over those 12 different dust dissolution models, deposition models, and 5 different circulation models. So it allows you to get at some level of error estimation on your estimates, which is shown here, right? So they came up with a deposition source of aluminium to the ocean with quantified error bars relative to hydrothermal. Of course, once you've done this for aluminium, you can do it for other elements of interest, like, for instance, how much iron you add to the ocean from dust deposition. Yeah. Once again, something that a flux that can be calculated together with associated uncertainties. Now, I've talked a lot about all of the possibilities of models of this kind, of the fact that we can optimize our models to observational data and produce something that is a best fit. But it's really important to me to talk about the fact that optimization is not as straightforward as it might sound. What do we mean when we optimize a model to data? For an ocean model, this involves minimizing the missed fit or the cost between some simulation of a tracer but distribution of a tracer that we simulate and the observations, right? Now, Obviously, that simulation is model dependent, or the distribution depends on which model you use. And this is something, of course, that is well known and can be mitigated by using different models or using variations of models to estimate uncertainty. And this is something that actually was shown rather nicely recently by Sugino and Oka, where in a model of zinc cycling, depending on which circulation model they use to study zinc cycling in the North Pacific, whether it's MEROC or OSIM, they essentially would come to entirely different conclusions as to what controls the distribution of this micronutrient in the ocean. With the one model, it's external input from margins. With the other, it's internal regeneration. Right? And that getting a handle on that kind of model dependency is really important through careful studies like this. Something that is, I think, that we also really need to keep our minds focused on in thinking about the results of optimized models, though, is the other 2 points on this slide. The question is always, how do we define fit or misfit between models and observations? We're always going to calculate some sort of difference between the model and the observation. We're usually going to square it. We might calculate the absolute difference. We might choose to sum up those differences over all of the transects that we have, as some people have done. We might choose to define certain regions in the ocean. And why this is important is because the observations themselves are not perfectly distributed, right? And GeoTraces, when we're thinking about global optimization, GeoTraces, the distribution of GeoTraces data is where the cruises have gone. This is an example of zinc data from the IDP 2017. And there is an interaction between these 2 aspects that are key to model optimization that were explored by Claudia Eisenring when she was here at ETH, because it's rather fascinating. I mean, in a zinc cycling model that we ran in the transport matrix framework, she was able to show that this particular model behavior, which is how the stoichiometry of zinc phosphate uptake changes with zinc concentration. All of these, the red line is the right answer, you might say, right? It's what they're hoping to retrieve from the model. And all of these different lines are objectively optimal solutions given the real data distribution, given variations in ocean circulation, and given different metrics used to calculate best fit or not. And you can see that depending on the data distribution, depending on what misfit function you use, you can come up with different solutions that seem to be optimally or objectively optimized. So this is just to make the point that while transport matrix methods are very, very useful in that they're computationally efficient and have a low entrance barrier, meaning that you use a high-level scripting language like Python or MATLAB, and you can get distributions within seconds on a laptop, which really allows you to test all sorts of stuff. They also have problems like the fact that they don't have seasonal variability. They don't have the spatial resolution to represent margins very well. And so you really require some care in translating those results to the real world. I'm going to jump over a few slides to get to something that I wanted to talk about at the very end. I'll briefly say that obviously there are other methods like the ones that An have used or Koenig et al. Have used or Hui Zhu have used that one can use to answer specific questions at smaller scales, at shorter time scales, or over more integrated spaces. And I wanted to come back in the last couple of minutes and sort of go back to this GeoTraces program diagram and think about where we might be going as we sort of really enter the data synthesis phase of this program. And I wanted to pull out as examples sort of three interesting places in which over the course of the 20 years of GeoTraces, I think there have been real changes in how we think about the Earth system as it relates to the interaction between the margins of the ocean and the ocean itself, and sort of where we might be going. One of those is how the terrestrial weathering community has begun to think about silicate weathering, how to some extent the oceanographic community has begun to think about silicate weathering, which is no longer that rivers flow into the sea and provide, maybe varied by estuaries, dissolved constituents to the ocean, but rather that we have a silicate weathering continuum that doesn't stop at the coast, but continues on through the primary weathering of fresh silicate materials that either come in from dust or through rivers. We have reverse weathering that happens dependent on sedimentary redox conditions. And that could happen both on shelves as well as deep into the ocean. In another domain, another really interesting thing over the last few years has been how we understand the abyssal overturning circulation and how that depends on how the seafloor is distributed, and the fact that we have so much of the deep ocean that is exposed to the large ocean area of the deep ocean, and where roughness of topography determines diapicnal mixing and can produce a deep overturning circulation determined by topography roughness. And finally, another way of thinking about the ocean that has come out from a recent paper here, also following on quite a bit of prior literature, focuses on the importance of benthic fluxes at the very bottom of the ocean. Of course, shelf fluxes we've known about for a long time, and how that links together with the abyssal circulation in determining large-scale distributions. I don't want to take up too much of Arianna's time, so I'll stop here just to say that given the wealth of geochemical data we have from GeoTraces, there's a lot of really exciting work to be done to bring all of this together and linking these domains. I'll stop here with a brief acknowledgement to students, mentors, and colleagues who've been really important in thinking about ocean distributions of traces.
Thank you so much for the big picture and giving us introduction about using transport matrix model to learn about processes in the ocean trace metal cycling. So next we're gonna hear from Arianna Olivelli about her work on using machine learning to study lead in the ocean. So it's on yours, Arianna.
Can you see my screen? Perfect. All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks again to Anne and the rest of the GeoTraces Early Career Committee for inviting me to present. Before I start with my presentation, I thought I would give you a quick overview of how my talk is structured. So I will first give some background of what I mean with mapping and introduce you very briefly to lead and its isotopes. I will then use most of my time to present some of the work I did in my PhD, in which I mapped lead concentration and isotope compositions using machine learning and the GeoTraces IDP 2021. And then I'll have a couple of slides in which I want to share some of the lessons I've learned doing this exercise of mapping and how I think machine learning can be applied in GeoTraces in the next phase and how these techniques can help our community. So what does mapping mean? Very simply, it means filling observational gaps in space and in time. The reason why in time is in brackets here is because in this specific domain, so for the work I'm presenting on lead and for all the trace metal maps that have been produced until now, the gaps are only filled in space. So the map products don't have any temporal resolution, they're just climatologies. And what I mean visually is going from what we have on the left. So this sparse distribution of, for instance, lead concentration in the top row and lead 206, 207 in the bottom row, which comes from the IDP 2021. To what we have on the right, which are the gap-filled maps that I produced with the work that I'll present later. So what you see in the background is the reconstruction based on the machine learning algorithm. And what you see in the black dots or black edge dots are the true values of the observations. So you can see that in general, these kind of algorithms can extrapolate well the information that we have, and they can learn meaningful relationships. So why do we want to map? There are three main reasons. The first one is that the observational coverage that we have is too sparse for us to study large-scale distribution of trace metals and their isotopes when looking at global scales, regional scales. It's quite hard to synthesize this information. The second reason why we're interested in mapping is because it can facilitate data model comparisons. You've heard from Greg what kind of outputs we get, what we see from models. Maps could be an intermediate means to compare models and observations. And the third reason why mapping is interesting is because maps are based on are purely data driven. So basically, they're built by deriving statistical or mathematical relationships between the target of what we want to map and some ancillary variables. So it means that we don't need to know and parameterize the entire biogeochemical cycle of a trace metal or and its isotopes, but we can have a great overview of the distribution of trace metal just by inferring the relationship with, for instance, other oceanographic variables, such as temperature, salinity, or nutrients. Until recently, most of the mapping has been done using statistical interpolation methods such as optimum interpolation or data interpolating variational analysis, or DIVA, which you might have used consciously or unconsciously because it's what is the backbone for gap filling in ODV. So when we have ODV plots and we go from our individual profiles to plotting a full section, what we're using is DIVA. Machine learning came to the game a bit later, but what it does is it identifies non-linear relationship between a target variable, so what we want to map, in my case, for instance, lead concentration or isotope composition, and a set of input features that have a relationship with the target. That could be, for instance, atmospheric inputs, nutrient distribution in the ocean, temperature, salinity, density, so on and so forth. And I'm not the first person who's mapped trace metals in GeoTraces. Zinc, copper, cadmium were mapped by Roshan. also barium and iron were mapped with machine learning in the last 3 years or so. And all these efforts have been very useful for me to understand how to proceed with my own work and how to map not only lead concentration, but isotopes. And isotopes, like my work for lead isotopes, is the first map of isotopes in GeoTraces. Going on to lead, lead is the 38th most abundant element in the Earth's crust, but we have very little of it in the ocean, on the orders of parts per trillion. It's reversibly scavenged through the water column by particulate matter, meaning that concentrations are generally larger at the surface than at the bottom. And it's a key parameter to measure on all GeoTraces cruises because it traces anthropogenic inputs from human activities on land to the ocean. We, in the 20th century, lead pollution increased drastically on land and, of course, on the ocean due to the use of leaded gasoline. And since the 70s, 80s, we've had phase out and complete global ban in the use of leaded gasoline, which we can trace and see in the records of seawater lead concentration and isotope composition in different basins. And you will see later how that is visible when we map globally. Isotopes in this case are a very useful tool to trace different source of inputs of lead to the ocean because they act as fingerprints for different sources. So we can identify dust, anthropogenic or natural lead by looking at the isotopic composition of the seawater we are analyzing. And that's also interesting when we're going to map and try to follow these fingerprints through the ocean. I will then move on to what the main part of this talk, which is how I actually developed these maps and what we can do with them. I tried to synthesize the work that is published in that was published in Earth System Science Data in 2025. Hopefully as successfully, like in a successful way, and make it as digestible as possible. But if you have any question other than being able to ask them later, please feel free to reach out to me or refer to the paper if you're interested in knowing more about how this work was done. So I showed you before that we have very sparse observation distribution. In the maps, I forgot to say, these are all the locations where we have collected lead as part of GeoTraces as per the IDP 2021. And you can see in the histogram that most of the observations we have are from the surface layers and then decrease drastically with depth. So my aims for this mapping project were twofold. So the first aim was to produce global three-dimensional maps of lead concentration and isotope compositions to use as a benchmark for future levels of pollution. And as I consider all samples to be collected at the same time, so there is no temporal resolution, this could be seen as a climatology of lead distribution in the GeoTraces era. The second thing I wanted to do was to identify the most important sampling location for future cruises. And with that, I mean locations where map uncertainty is the highest, so where the machine learning algorithms struggle the most in producing certain reconstructions. And to do so, to create these maps and meet these two aims, I first had to develop three different data sets, one for each of my target variables, which are lead concentration, lead 206, 207, and lead 208, 207, and collocate the observations with a series of features that are used by the algorithm to learn the relationship between these oceanographic or atmospheric parameters and the target. So For these features, we have like temperature, salinity, nutrient distribution, or in this case, I'm also using black carbon and dust as in the atmosphere as proxies for human and natural inputs of lead to the ocean. For these variables, we have full fields. So there are climatologies obtained from either CMEMS or the World Ocean Atlas. And then I co-locate the values of these variables with the locations where we have observations on the map. So based on the co-location of, let's say, lead concentration with all the other variables, the models learn a relationship, and that relationship is used to extrapolate the predicted values of lead concentration to areas where we've never sampled before. In order to develop these models, I used a machine learning algorithm called XGBoost, which is a tree ensemble algorithm that builds trees in a sequential manner. I will not go in the details of how this works, but if you're interested, there's plenty of literature about it. But what you need to know, more importantly, from like a development perspective, is that when we are training a machine learning model or developing a machine learning model, we want to use part of our data to make sure that the model, check that the model is learning the right relationship. So from my 3 data sets for the concentration and the 2 isotope compositions, I removed completely part of a transect that you can see in orange here. And I use it as a geographic test set to mimic areas in the ocean where we have no observations at all. And then the remaining data is used 80% for training the model and 20% randomly chosen for testing the model. Models are tuned in a similar way as you would tune parameters for a numerical model, and I will not go in detail on how we do this. But after several iterations of model tuning, I reached a model that I was fairly happy with. So what you can see here in these plots are for the top row lead concentration and for the bottom row lead 206, 207. I'm not presenting any results for 208, 207 for sake of time, but they're largely similar. On the x-axis, you have the true values. On the y-axis, you have the predicted values by the machine learning model. And ideally, you want to be as close to the 1-to-1 line as possible. And you can see here that the lead concentration model is performing very well in the large and most sampled basin of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Ocean, and is struggling more in the polar basins where dynamics and data availability is more challenging. And on the other hand, the 206, 207 model is performing very well in the Indian and in the Pacific Oceans. In the Southern Ocean, despite having only 7 samples to test on, seems to be learning the distribution really well. Although I would say that we need a lot more data to be sure that we can validate model predictions. And it's struggling in the Atlantic, which historically has been the basin with most pollution. So and also the most dynamic of all from a physical perspective. So I would say that I was happy with how the models perform, and I could understand where the limitations were. So at that point, I went on to the next step, which was creating this global map. So use the extrapolated relations to predict full fields. And this is what you see is lead concentration varying with depth. So the model varies, the reconstruction goes to 5,500 meters. And we can see that the highest lead concentration is found in the surface Indian Ocean and in the North Pacific. We have subsurface lead maxima in the North Atlantic and North Pacific, which is sinking pollution from previous decades. And we also observe high surface lead concentration in South and Central America, near South and Central America, Western Africa, and Southeast Asia. And interestingly, these are locations where we have very few observations. So it would be really important to get new data from these regions to verify model predictions, especially because we're talking about high concentrations. For 206, 207, I should say here that the lowest values represent more anthropogenic inputs and highest values represent more natural inputs. We have the lowest lead 206, 207 values in the surface Indian Ocean, but we also have subsurface 206, 207, like strong anthropogenic 206, 207 signature that is spreading from the Southern Ocean towards the equator in the Southern Hemisphere. That you will see appearing here. And that could be either persisting pollution transported northward or recently remobilized lead that is deposited on certain areas of formation of Antarctic intermediate water and again is moving northward. So another interesting thing to do is try to understand how the models make these predictions and where these like on the basis of what information the model predicts a certain concentration. So what I've used is a technical Shapley additive explanation that gives us information about how much a feature contributes to increasing or decreasing the value of a prediction compared to the mean. So if we have a positive, and I will not go much in detail, but we can see how much, we can see here that temperature, dust, black carbon, and salinity, for instance, are the most important features for determining lead concentrations. And for instance, that low values of temperature or low values of dust that are represented by the yellow colors are leads to a lower predicted values for lead. So, and based on this information and knowing where we have low temperature or low dust inputs, we can say, we can prove whether the model has learned correctly the relationship between like the chemistry and physics and our lead distribution. I also said that I would provide some information on where we should go sampling. So I generated 100 of these maps, not just one, starting with different splits of training and testing data, and identified the polar regions and the South Atlantic as the region, as the areas where we have the highest uncertainty, and together with the lowest performance of the models in the Southern Ocean, I think this is the region that we should prioritize. And I'll be very quick in my conclusions here. So these are the first maps of lead concentration and isotope compositions that have ever been developed that include anthropogenic lead. So until now, we only had some numerical model output from 2002 that only consider the natural cycle of lead. These new maps are very much in line with observations and show that the North Pacific and the Indian Ocean have the highest level of pollution, and that we can see previous pollution from past decades sinking in the North Atlantic and in the Pacific. And most interestingly, I think, from a pollution perspective and dynamic perspective, is that we see this highly anthropogenic fingerprint of lead that is spreading in the Southern Hemisphere from the Southern Ocean towards the equator. And the use for these maps is, what I foresee as use for these maps is, of course, is for sure to use them as benchmarks for future levels of pollution, to help with model development and with model data comparisons. And I'll be very brief in saying what I think is really important to learn, to apply if you want to map yourself. When doing machine learning, it's really important that we're using the data of best quality possible in order to get meaningful results. I think in GeoTraces, we're very lucky because lucky we do a lot of work as a community to ensure that data is of the highest quality possible. But it's also important that the other information that is included in the model doesn't include outliers, or incorrect values, because if the model learns from bad data, it will produce meaningless results, or what is used, like how it's said in the community, garbage in, garbage out. It's important to tune your models carefully so that you can identify the best models for the parameters or the trace method that you're trying to map. And also it's important to map with a clear aim. So keep in mind what you want to do with these maps afterwards, if you ever want to produce maps. I think that for GeoTraces, mapping is the most prominent use of machine learning at the moment. I think that depending on data availability, we could start resolving time. So potentially have seasonal or monthly climatologies and not just a snapshot in time map of trace metals. And this would be particularly important for micronutrients or other elements that have seasonal cycle in their distribution. And what I want to say is also that I see maps only as a tool, and our job doesn't really end at mapping. I mean, for me, it was fun to develop these maps, and it's still what I like to do in my day-to-day. But I want to stress that I find them only as means to expand our scientific understanding of trace metal distribution and dynamics. So we should use these maps to study processes, to maybe couple them with general ocean circulation models, and have an intermediate, and use them as boundary conditions from which to learn more about the dynamics and distribution of trace metals and answer questions that we cannot answer by just looking at individual observations. And I'll end here because I think I've taken more than enough time for my presentation. Thank you very much, and thanks to my supervisors, Tina Varderflint and Mark Raykamper, who supported all my PhD work, my new group at VLIS, where I'm now working on oxygen distribution, and everyone in GeoTraces who's ever produced lead data that allowed me to do this work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arianna. And I think we have a few questions in the chat. And first question is for Greg. Diksha, you want to ask question, or you want me to read the question for you?
Hi. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Arianna. Thank you so much. But I think I have a question for Greg. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Greg. My question is, first is I have two questions. First is for semi-enclosed basins like Med Sea and Black Sea where I work. So there's a deep water renewal is episodic. So simple box model is sufficient, or do I need a full circulation model? First is this question, and the second question is Med Sea and Black Sea are underrepresented in GeoTraces synthesis effort compared to the open ocean. So do you think that semi-enclosed basin could have a role to play as a natural laboratory for testing model assumptions, given that the circulation is pretty restricted?
Thanks, Diksha. So I think the question of what model you need depends on the question. This is a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think what model you need depends on the question you want to answer. I know the question that you want to answer, which has to do with silicon isotopes in the Med Sea.
Yes.
I think possibly I think given the residence time, if you're thinking about sort of if you're thinking about the distribution of silicon and its isotopes, given the residence time within the deep Med Sea, you're probably okay integrating over that through the use of a box model. Would be my answer. When it comes to restricted basins, absolutely. I think these are perfect places to understand metal behavior, redox, any kind of geochemistry. As somebody who works in Switzerland, I mean, even a lake, right? I mean, there are plenty of lakes that work as excellent laboratories for understanding metal behavior. And in fact, quite a bit of work has been done, for instance, on the behaviors of nickel, zinc, and so on in the Black Sea originally. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Arianna, can I quickly ask one question, if the time permits?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So the one thing which I didn't understand well was that with sparse and heterogeneous geotraces data, how do you avoid the model or just interpolating between well-sampled regions and performing poorly in data-poor areas? Like, how do you validate predictions where you have no measurements to check against?
So sorry if that was not clear. That's the main that's the main issue with these models. But so I mentioned that I kept out full transect in the North Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And I use that in addition to the random test set everywhere. So the random test set included every locations where we had, like possibly every locations where we had where we have samples, where we have collected samples. But the idea with that completely held out test set is to mimic regions where we have no observation at all in the water column. So there are two checks that I did. The first is seeing how well the model performed on the random test set, and the second on how it performed on this held out transect in the North Atlantic. And for all models, so the concentration and isotope compositions, the held out transect had lower performance than the random test set, but it was still enough for me to believe that we could trust the model predictions. And then where we have no data, I think that's the best we can do. What I think we should do is go out and collect more information and hopefully validate whether the model is correct or rubbish. And I hope it's not the latter.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Arianna.
Yeah, I think we have time maybe for we're getting to hour, but maybe we have one more time for one more question. I think we have one question from Hưng An Chien for Ariana. So maybe if you want to ask your question, if you don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I think Arianna, very interesting work. So I was just wondering because lead is quite particle reactive, and in your list of arsenic parameters, there was no like proxy for particles. So you've already received my question, so I just save time.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. The problem is, and there are two, like my answer is two parts, let's say. The first part is that when you are using, like when you're mapping, you need full fields for your predictor features. And there are no full fields of suspended particulate matter throughout the water column that are available anywhere from observations. So that's the limitation that I had to deal with. And the way I tried to supply for it was by using chlorophyll A concentration at the surface. And so I passed the same information throughout the water column for all depth that are considered. about the chlorophyll A concentration at that grid cell location. So from the predictor features. And then I let the model learn for itself based on where in the water column it was, how much chlorophyll concentration was important as a feature. So it's a limitation, but I think that's the best I could do at the time with the information available.
Okay, so thank you, everyone.
Hi,
I think
hi, Anne.
yeah.
Anne, we have. I think
Yeah.
we can have a bit more time for questions. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just gonna say that like we're getting to an hour. So if you have to leave, you please feel free to leave. But thank you all. And just a reminder before I get back to the question that like we're gonna have another seminar on May 26th on trace metal input in polar environments. So just a reminder. So hi, Marcus. Feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, just a short question to Arianna. Nice talk. I was just puzzled. You predicted where we should go to sample more seawater lead isotopes and seawater concentrations, and you showed the zonal transect in the southern Atlantic. And isn't that where you published your record from? Why do you want to go there again?
Yeah, and if you like, it's exactly that. And I think that's the answer. So my work in the South Atlantic showed that we have reversible scavenging at 40 degrees south on the GA10 transect, but we don't have reversible scavenging on the GAO2 transect that is what in Western South Atlantic. So I think that that confuses the model quite a lot because the model doesn't have enough information to distinguish, like we're just using a climatology of chlorophyll A concentration and of like oceanographic parameters. So like the machine learning algorithm itself cannot distinguish why sometimes we have higher concentrations a certain lead isotope composition at 1,000 meters or 2,000 meters, and why at nearby locations we don't see that. We could see a completely different signature. So I think that's what like in this like sporadic events that we're not capturing on all cruises, I think are confounding the model quite importantly.
Is measuring chlorophyll A so accurate?
Well, chlorophyll A comes from remote sensing. So they're satellite products. They are fairly accurate, but it's a climatology. So if what we observed in the South Atlantic was just I believe it was like if I remember correctly, it was in March that the GA10 transect took place, and in the overlapping station with GAO2, there was no, for instance, signal of reversible scavenging, and the cruises were a couple of months apart.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
I don't know if there's any other question. If not, so maybe we can give another round of applause for Greg and Arianna again for wonderful talks. Thank you so much all for joining today, and hope that we can see many of you again in May. Thank you. Have a great day or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much.